Just a few miles north of Seagirt, New Jersey, and its red brick lighthouse, lies Asbury Park. Asbury Park is still a very popular resort town, and to this day, its crowning glory is its spectacular, stately convention centre. The convention hall was built in the late 1920s, right on the boardwalk. It heralded a golden age for the Jersey Shore, where thousands flocked for summer vacation at the beach. Pageants, parades, and events littered the summer calendar. Looming large over all of it was the gorgeous Beaux Arts Hall. But its most famous moment came in September 1934, when the hall, instead, became the backdrop to something bizarre and terrible. And it was here, just behind me, just over 90 years ago, that morning in 1934, the residents of Asbury Park, New Jersey, awoke to a truly incredible sight. There, grounded firmly on the sandy bottom, was the charred hulk of a once proud ocean liner. In full view of thousands of curious onlookers were all the buckled hull plates, row upon row of twisted and shattered portholes, the tough paint peeled and torn off. Disturbingly, in the davits sat boats designed to save human lives. Instead, they'd burned with the ship. One had even broken in half. The entire smoking palace of destruction had come to rest just off the convention hall's walkway. It was practically within touching distance. Hours earlier, all through the early morning of the 8th, the ship had burned uncontrollably before a small flotilla of rescue ships had arrived on station. Most notable among the fleet was the Paramount. Her brave crew had surged out into the chop in their boat, darting back and forth in a desperate attempt to pull as many people out of the water that they could. It was tough work, but they were driven on by the ragged and weary survivors they came across, some just clinging to life. They were guided at times by an airplane, with New Jersey Governor A. Harry Moore aboard. The pilot would dip his wing over the position of a body in the water. The Bogan family toiled hard for hours and eventually gathered around 67 people, dodging bodies in the water so they wouldn't damage them. The effort was heroic, but it made the Coast Guards look poor by contrast. For starters, the US Coast Guard didn't pick up the Morro Castle's distress call themselves. It had been relayed to them some time afterward, and it put them on the back foot right away. At 4:30 am, the cutter Tampa, moored at Staten Island, prepared to get underway, but she didn't make it to the scene until nearly 8 am, about the same time as the cutter Calhoun. And even then, she took up station to windward of the ship, away from where passengers might have been blown and drifted. Other Coast Guard ships weren't made aware of the unfolding disaster until the morning wore on. The fact was that there was no love lost between the fishermen of the Jersey coast and the Coast Guard themselves, who regularly searched their boats, and tensions ran high. The fishermen were quick to blame the Coast Guard and accuse them of cowardice and bungling, while the Coast Guard reports laid out a fantastical timeline that took most of the credit for the rescue. Eventually, all that could be done had been done. Survivors had been fished out of the water, sodden and miserable. Among them was Alma Hill. When a first fishing boat had passed her by, she almost gave up. But a half hour later, another came and dragged her aboard. She had been in the water for hours, and her silver Elgin watch had stopped at around 4 am forever. After 8 hours in the water herself, Selma Filzer was found by the Paramount, but her new husband, Charles, was nowhere to be seen. This is the kind of tragic human drama that played out over hours as the little rescue boats did all that they could. Some survivors were missed. They had to make it ashore by themselves. The Gianninis had jumped off the stern at the last possible moment and been surrounded by darkness. But just piercing the suffocating black was a light. It was the Seagirt Lighthouse, 12 or 13 miles away, and with a raging sea before it. But it gave the Gianninis hope. They swam and swam with all their might. When they got tired, they just stopped and floated together. Against all the odds, and for somewhere between 12 and 16 hours, this newlywed couple battled against the waves until they were bodily washed ashore on the beach in front of a group of spectators so dazed they didn't even react to help. Meanwhile, still aboard the ship was Captain William Worms, and a small group of crew, including the radioman, Alanya, and Rogers. They'd seen 2 passengers off and then waited for rescue themselves, but the question soon arose of what to do about the massive ship. Worm stood on the bow after 24 punishing hours awake trying to negotiate a tow with a tugboat when the cutter Tampa had arrived on scene and offered the tow instead. Worms agreed and signalled in Morse code with a flashlight that he and his men would stay there until a line could be got aboard. Eventually, they did it after considerable fuss and fighting. A 12-inch thick line was passed up to the men on the Morro Castle's bow so the ship, what was left of it, could be towed to safety. But now the men ran into a frustrating problem. Morro Castle's anchor had been dropped while the ship had drifted through the night. To raise it would require the use of the massive motorised windlass, except the ship now lay dead in the water, completely powerless. There was just one thing for it. Through the morning and the early afternoon, the remaining crew worked in shifts to saw through the 3-inch thick steel links with a hand hacksaw. The Tampa waited patiently, but then they got a horrifying report over the radio that other Coast Guard vessels, like small lifeboats, had still been patrolling and plucking people out of the water while Tampa had sat at anchor on the wrong side of the ship. As the anchor lines were cut through, people still washed ashore all up and down the Jersey coast, alive but haggard. Through the surf, they appeared like ghosts in tattered night clothes. Locals rushed to help and drag them ashore wherever they could before rushing them off to hospital in police cars, ambulances, and even private vehicles. Others opened up their homes to these unexpected, tragic guests and warmed them with blankets and hot coffee. The lifeboats came ashore in the thunderous surf too, tragically underloaded. A few of the lost rescue boats made a landing as well. But back in New York, crowds of people stood around, frustrated. They'd been waiting for their friends and loved ones to come back from the holiday of a lifetime at the Wardlines Pier, but no ship had materialised at 7 AM as planned. The Morro Castle, it seemed, was missing. In fact, Morro Castle was not missing. The anchor had finally been let go around noon, and the chain roared and rattled out the hawser, freeing the ship. With the 600-foot-long cable attached and Paramount ready to begin towing the massive hulk, Worms and his men at last abandoned the vessel, clambering over the side in a rope ladder. But the boat they stepped into was draped with bodies of passengers who'd been fished dead from the sea. Worms was the last to leave. He'd tried to stay, but he'd been forced off, legend says, by a Coast Guardsman at gunpoint. As the boat pulled away, the group looked on in unbelieving horror at the ruined ship they had left still smoking behind them. The tiny cutter, Tampa, struggled forward with Morro Castle in tow, but it was like pulling an obstinate elephant with a golf cart. The seas took the big liner heaving this way and that, and for hours the sad convoy battled the worsening conditions, but by early afternoon the search and rescue mission had been suspended by the Coast Guard because the weather was just too severe. But meanwhile, Tampa was in a David and Goliath fight to bring the big liner in. But it was losing the fight. By early evening, the Morro Castle was beginning to drag Tampa in closer and closer to shore. In an effort to get the big ship back out to deeper water, Tampa throttled up hard, but the strain was too much. With a thunderous crack, like a cannon shot, the 12-inch line parted with enormous force. The cutter's engines died, and her skipper rushed to drop an anchor so she wouldn't wash ashore. The Tampa came to a halt, but Morro Castle was now left to the winds and the currents. So it was that Morro Castle came to rest directly out the front of Asbury Park's convention hall. It was supposed to be the end of the summer season, a time when the city's attractions eased, shops and businesses began to shutter their doors. Instead, from miles around, thousands flocked to come see this incredible, terrible sight. A charred ocean liner resting just feet from the shoreline in one of America's seaside playgrounds. The restaurants opened once again and advertised the best views of the ship. The Ferris wheel turned, packed with sightseers. Disaster tourism was in full swing. With the Morro Castle beached high and dry, and hundreds of thousands of people watching on incredulously, naturally, the question began to arise in the minds of the public and officials alike. What had happened? One of the first steps for the investigation was to step aboard the ship and explore her ruined remains. Now, getting aboard was not a simple task. A breeches buoy was run between ship and shore, connected to the handily placed exhibition hall. The party could haul themselves aboard safely and step onto the steel skeleton that was still hot to the touch. Once aboard, crews were greeted with a shocking sight. The ship was nearly unrecognisable. The elegant interior spaces had been completely gutted. The fire was so hot it melted bulkheads and beams and bent them into abstract shapes. Virtually every inch of deckwood had been consumed, leaving behind exposed deck beams with bolts that once would have secured the planks. It's almost impossible to imagine a way Morro Castle could have been more destroyed. But the same inferno that had bent steel like it was soggy paper had also spared haunting touches of humanity. Resting on a deck was a tray of food, perhaps room service, set down by a steward or passenger with the charred remains of a pineapple still standing up on it. It was hoped that a thorough search of the ship might help give the answers that were so desperately needed. The first order of business was a cabin-to-cabin analysis. Not many people had been trapped in their staterooms. For most of Morro Castle's complement, the smoke or commotion had woken them up long before the fire had cut them off. The same could not be said for a few unfortunate souls on A deck. These were some of the finest staterooms on the ship, but they'd proved to be death traps when the fire had rushed up from B deck below and swept along the deck. In A3, where Miss Charlotte Cochrane had been asleep, molten jewellery, eyeglasses, and gold inlay teeth were found, then a few smoking bones still resting on her mattress springs. In A10, Max Berliner's cabin, cufflinks, wristwatches, all melted, gold teeth, and bones. A23, the stateroom Mrs. Caridad Sains had shared with her daughters, a jumble of scorched bones balanced on the deck beams. In the corridor outside, a human pelvis. In A16, Mrs. D'Orne's cabin, the skeleton of the whippet she'd had to abandon so quickly. Mixed into the ashes and detritus littering the floors of the rooms were all the effects, all the personal treasures that had been carefully packed and carted for an unforgettable holiday. Rings, thimbles, a penknife, Cuban coins, medals, necklaces, pearls, engraved watches, crosses. Almost anything that wasn't metal or bone had been eaten by fire, but these haunting touches of humanity remained. So thorough, so shocking was the destruction of the Morro Castle that little could be learned from its charred hulk. Any physical evidence of a possible cause for the fire was long gone. The palatial lounge with its elegant carvings and panels had been reduced to bare steel and existed only as a hole in the centre of the ship. It quickly earned the liner a slew of nicknames. Newsreels had once called her the Merchant Queen. Now they dubbed her the Ship of Death, the funeral ship. But if investigators were ever to get to the bottom of the tragedy, they'd need to look to the living, the survivors, the passengers and the crew who'd lived through the night and experienced the terror, felt the heat of the flames. And this is where things became difficult. The story, the events that happened, the characters involved, it all presented investigators with an incredibly complex web that had to be pieced apart bit by bit. The questions began to mount even as the ship's bedraggled survivors came to terms with what had just happened to them in hospital beds across the state. Investigators at the US Coast Guard had their work cut out for them. First and foremost was the cause of the blaze. Fires at sea were not infrequent in the days of steam when liners were covered in wood panelling and thick varnish. Back then, discarded cigarettes could be sucked back into open vents or portholes, igniting carpets and drapes. Many big passenger ships were lost this way from a simple moment of carelessness. But the uncomfortable fact was that the Morro Castle's fire seemed to have originated in the dead of night, with a storm raging up above and inside of a closed cabinet. It was the perfect storm. The fire doors hadn't been closed. The ship's course had been maintained long enough for the flames to take complete control of the vessel. And then there was her captain, Wilmot. He'd died suddenly, unexpectedly, on the last night, and command had fallen to his chief, William Worms. The radiomen gave their stories, with Chief Operator George Rogers being hailed a hero of the disaster. But in the event, a single, vague distress call had gone out at the 11th hour, and even then, only just. Only 5 passengers had left Morro Castle in one of the ship's lifeboats. The rest of the boats that launched were full of crew instead. In the end, counts showed that at least 124 of Morro Castle's complement had died. The alcohol, weapons and drug running, the political ties, the communist threat, the people smuggling. The serious issues with the story were disturbing as the image of the burnt-out ship itself. In many ways, this was just the start of the Morro Castle saga because the horrible truth is uncovered and then buried by the investigations to come shock even to this day. They'd lead to prison sentences, conspiracy, and murder. Understanding this complex web is no easy task today, let alone back in 1934 when it had first happened. To help pull the mystery apart, I travelled to Asbury Park, where Morro Castle washed up that September, and met with author, researcher and presenter Caitlin Doughty. Caitlin has dedicated her career to charting death practices around the world, serving as a mortician and advocating for funeral industry reform. She's currently working on an upcoming book detailing the work undertaken to retrieve Titanic's dead in 1912, and her research on that subject has given her unique knowledge in the subject of death at sea. We met in the shadow of the Asbury Park Convention Hall, where 90 years ago, just a few hundred feet away from us, the ship had sat smoking and ruined. 90 years ago, what would this beach have been like?
Just a macabre spectacle. Hundreds of thousands of people on this beach, and out in front of them, which they had no context for, this beached ocean liner, which was described as a smoldering coffin.
For those watching on, it would have been impossible to comprehend the nightmare the ship's passengers had endured, but as survivors gave statements, it began to paint a picture for investigators of true horror. They had to wind the clock back to understand the full magnitude of what had happened. It all began the evening of the 7th of September, just hours before the fire broke out, when Captain Wilmot had retired to his cabin early, complaining of stomach pain, and suddenly, unexpectedly, died.
When you think about it, people were dying on ocean liners all the time, right? But the death of a captain was really different. And yes, they still had to get all these passengers back to New York safely, but the big final dance was canceled. There wasn't as much drinking. All the public music was shut down because this funereal pall had fallen over everything. And there really was a different vibe entirely on the Morro Castle after the captain died.
With Wilmot's passing, command passed on to Chief Officer William Worms, but only because he had demanded the responsibility. His first task had been to deal with his dead predecessor. So what did they do with the captain's body?
There's an account from a steward who said he cleaned, dressed, and laid out the captain's body in his bed in his cabin. However, keep in mind, there's starting to be rumors circulating that his death might not have been entirely natural. And so they're trying to balance showing honor to their captain, while at the same time realizing that there's probably going to be some sort of forensic investigation that happens once they reach New York.
With the captain's body locked in his cabin, Worms turned his attention to getting his ship back to New York. For passengers, Wilmot's death was a sudden shock. He was a people pleaser through and through, and he'd do anything for his passengers. But beneath the veneer of confidence was a man stressed to his limit, because the ship under his command was deeply, deeply unhappy. Almost as soon as the dawn sun had revealed Morro Castle's charred hulk resting on the sand, movements were made for a hurried inquiry. The chief concern among investigators is that all the witnesses and survivors of disasters like this can disperse and scatter across the country and the world. They had to move quickly to get the truth out of them. Just 2 days after the fire, September 10th, 1934, it began. A panel was put together made of experts. For one, there was Carl C. Nielsen, a captain and district inspector of the Steamboat Inspection Service, who'd probed the sinking of the liner Vestris back in 1929. 2 other inspectors joined him, James Smith and John Crone, but overseeing all of it was Assistant Director of the Bureau of Navigation, Dickerson Hoover. This group of experienced professionals got to work hearing testimony and heart-wrenching tales of survival and death in New York, and the picture that witnesses painted was a disturbing one. It became obvious that Morro Castle's crew were badly underpaid and highly undisciplined. Because wages were so poor, crewmen supplemented their income by smuggling all kinds of contraband into the States from Cuba. Rum, marijuana, and concerningly, heroin apparently all found their way aboard. Discipline was so poor, the crew had taken to sleeping in unoccupied passenger cabins, a strange practice that would have been strongly discouraged in other lines, but it seems Wardline treated its crews with indifference. Testimony from Wardline's seamen and officers showed a picture of serious discontent and a captain straining to keep it all together as one cohesive unit. It had come to a head just weeks before his death and the fatal fire. On August 27, the ship had been off the Florida coast when an alarm sounded. Fire had broken out in a cargo hold down in the bowels of the hull. More than 60 bundles of cardboard and paper had erupted into flames that were doused and put out just before they could set the cargo around them on fire too. Most worrying of all was the crew's reaction, a bungled event that had nearly seen the ship burn in its entirety. In a letter to a friend, Wilmot said it had given him a jolt, and when investigators began to turn up more facts, it soon became clear why. For one, Morro Castle was sailing regularly into an increasingly hostile port. Cuba had been in the grips of revolutionary spirit for some time, and by 1934 things were getting dire. Communist sympathizers and anarchists rallied furiously, and the image of Imperial America was distasteful to the most patriotic of Cuban hearts. The American relationship with Cuba had always been testy at best. In February 1898, the battleship USS Maine had been anchored in Havana Harbor during the Cuban War of Independence when it erupted into a massive explosion. The disaster partly drove America to war with Spain when it was announced that Spanish sabotage had been the culprit. The truth was that no evidence of sabotage existed whatsoever, and the blast was most likely just an accident. But in the struggle of major powers like America and Spain, Cuba had acted largely like the rope in a game of tug-of-war. As the spirit of Cuban independence began to burn, some passionate reactionaries turned to violence. There were bombings across the country, even as Wardline's liners had carried shiploads of happy tourists into Havana to visit what had been billed as a fun, tropical escape. The shore visits had to be carefully curated to avoid the worst of the truth, that Cuba was a country on the verge of something immense. It resulted in uncomfortable scenes. Once, refugees had demanded asylum right there on the docks as Morro Castle's shocked passengers had been boarding to return home. Some passengers were mugged on Havana's streets on their visits. There had been riots, demonstrations, and then the worst had happened. As Morro Castle was about to leave on one of her routine return voyages from Havana, she was even shot at by rebels. To some of those that fought for their nation's independence, Morro Castle and her sister Oriente might have stood as symbols of arrogant imperialism. This was the kind of toxic environment Morro Castle steamed into every week, and Captain Wilmot had been warned personally by the chief of the city's police to be very careful of communist agitators and possible sabotage. In his report on the August fire, Wilmot dismissed the seriousness of the event and suggested it was an errant cigarette that had just started the blaze. But his mind must have darted between any number of possible causes, and in the privacy of his cabin it's not hard to imagine paranoia setting in at the thought of Cuban rebels sneaking aboard and setting fire to his beautiful ship. But less than a month after the small fire in the cargo hold, Morro Castle had burned completely. So concerning was the threat of communist sabotage that the FBI immediately sprang to work interviewing survivors and compiling top-secret files on key crew members and more. Their findings showed the true depth of unhappiness aboard the ship, and even cast doubt on the nature of Wilmot's death. Captain Wilmot's crew were largely a surly lot, unhappy with their pay to be sure, but the environment they worked in, the culture on board, was simply rotten. Living conditions aboard the ship were very poor, the food nearly rancid. Shore leave was frequently cancelled. Chief Officer William Worms had long wanted his own command, but now he was aging and regularly overlooked. Even when Captain Wilmot was away, command passed to skippers from other ships. He was disliked by many who feared that he was a weak leader, but possibly most of all by Chief Engineer Eben Abbott. The rivalries and the politics started at the top and worked their way down the hierarchical chain. One of the notable troublemakers had been young radio man George Alanya. For one thing, there had been rumours that he was a communist sympathiser, something that put him on Captain Wilmot's radar to begin with. Worst of all though, Alanya had been surprised at the poor state of crew conditions aboard Morro Castle and actively spoke out against it, stirring up discontent among the crew and building support for a strike. The problem was that Captain Wilmot couldn't do anything about the radio man. He was not employed by Wardline, but the Radio Marine Corporation of America. Wilmot was stuck with Alanya until the corporation could send Wardline a replacement. Alanya may have been a troublemaker, but he was far from being the most disliked man in the radio room. Working alongside him was the chief operator, George Rogers. Rogers was a tall, unattractive character who made people around him generally feel uncomfortable. A leering, strange man with an odd sense of humour. He took a seat before the inquiry committee and painted a picture of heroism. He said he'd been awakened 20 minutes after fire had broken out, that already smoke was beginning to pour into the wireless room and sting his eyes. He said that he'd sent Alanya to go get orders from the bridge and waited because wireless regulations were strict and he needed the captain's okay. Because he waited so long and finally got the message sent at the last moment, Rogers and Alanya were some of the handful of crew who stayed on the ship all night. Rogers said he'd even tried to jump into the ocean to save a female passenger, but he was stopped by Captain Worms, who feared for his safety. In his own testimony, Rogers called Alanya, his assistant, a troublemaker who tried to stage the strike over bad conditions on board. In fact, Rogers began to paint Alanya out to be a possible suspect. He told the committee that well before the fire, Captain Wilmot had conferred with Rogers and asked, "What's the matter with Alanya? Is he crazy? I don't trust that man." Rogers had written letters accusing Alanya of staging walkouts and agitation that bordered on a kind of communist mutiny. He even said he'd found questionable material in Alanya's locker, components to make a kind of chemical bomb. It was a compelling story, one the press ran with. The picture of the dashing radio man urgently sending out a distress call was one the public was used to and enjoyed. They'd seen heroes like this emerge from the Titanic, the Empress of Ireland, Lusitania, and other disasters. But Rogers' distress call had been anything but urgent. The truth was that George Rogers was far from being the long-suffering hero of the Morro Castle that the media painted him out to be. The ship's crew were badly disciplined, but Rogers was something else. He was a troublemaker, somebody who toys with people for his own pleasure. He had pitted his junior radiomen against one another and stirred them up pitilessly. His conferences with Captain Wilmot added badly to the old man's stress. Rogers told wild tales of death threats and sabotage and confirmed the captain's worst fears. He wrote letter after letter indicting his fellow crewmen of plots to take the captain down or the ship. The most disturbing of all had been his behaviour the night of the fire. His fellow radiomen remarked on his coolness, his unusual levity, that even as the flames licked at the wireless room's porthole, Rogers remained composed, almost cheerful. In the end, the inquiry found that he was the hero he had painted himself out to be. He went on stage and radio shows billed as Sparks Rogers and opened his own radio shop, but investigators had failed to look into his dark past. It would all come out years later at a trial for murder. With the investigators beginning to get a clearer picture of the strange conditions aboard Morro Castle, they turned their attention to Captain Wilmot himself. The rumour had been that he had been poisoned by an unhappy crew member. The night of the fire, Wilmot had retired early to his cabin, complained of stomach pain, and then suddenly died. The ship's doctor, Van Zyl, had concluded it was a heart attack, so had 3 passenger doctors aboard too, but Van Zyl could never give his testimony because he'd died in the disaster that followed. To get to the bottom of it, all eyes turned to the mangled wreck of the still smoking ship, because aboard her, somewhere, was what remained of her once beloved captain, and the critical evidence that might prove if his death, and the resulting fire, had been an intentional act.
There's an incredible account from the Asbury Park chief of fire of finding Captain Wilmot's body, and it was in his cabin, but the fire and the heat was so intense that the legs of his bed had actually melted and his body has slid down. And body is a bit of a strong term here. It was essentially a set of charred bones and ashes.
Well then, given what was left behind, were they even able to determine if there had been foul play involved?
They really thought there was a chance that they could, which is why, even though the body was in the state that it was in, they decided to collect it and bring it in and have it autopsied, believing that either chemists or toxicologists might be able to see if there was, for instance, poison in his system. They didn't find any poison in his system. What they did find was traces of lead and copper because of the high heat and metals in his cabin.
So is this any conclusive proof that he was or wasn't poisoned?
Here's the thing, we can't say that with 100% certainty. We discovered in our research that the man who actually performed the toxicology tests was a man named Alexander Gettler, who was the guy in this field. He was the father of forensic toxicology. But when you have someone at the cutting edge of this technology, there's still so much more to go and more to learn and tests to devise and technology to develop. So in the 1930s, did they have what was needed to test for the poison that was in his system? That's unclear. We can never really know with complete certainty if he was poisoned or not.
Wilmot's death was one thing. The fire that engulfed his ship was another thing entirely. Even as the inquiry committee met day by day through September, victims of the ship washed up ashore. As stories from passengers and crew began to clarify the frantic, sudden events of the night, the discovery at the stern of the ship told of a tragic fight for survival. There, scattered on the after decks, were clothes, belts, trousers, shoes, all hastily discarded as passengers made the decision to stay behind or leap into the unknown.
It sounds like the passengers and crew of the Morro Castle who were left on board had very few choices available.
I think a steward said that for passengers, the choice was burn or jump, meaning there was this inferno of fire behind you. It's actually very similar to what I think people experienced during 9/11 in the towers, where behind you is a wall of fire and in front of you is a jump that will very likely lead to your death. So it's sort of choosing between two deaths. And this existential option was so intense for some passengers that they waited a very long time. And there are accounts of women waiting so long on the deck of Morro Castle that they inhaled smoke to the point that when they finally jumped into the water, they didn't have the strength to survive the time they needed to spend there.
The rescue efforts had been ragtag but dedicated, with volunteers coming from far and wide to help where they could. Notable among them were the Bogan family aboard their boat, Paramount.
There's a story of a family who brought their fishing boat out to rescue people, just of their own volition, and they did. They rescued 67 people. But they describe again and again coming upon these clumps of people in the water, and one of the family members has died. And they're telling the living people, you have to let this person go, let them float away, someone else will pick them up. There's only room for living people in this boat. But it was so difficult for them to give up the corpse of their family member, to just leave it behind in the water. And you can understand that. I don't know what I would do if I was in that same situation.
For those who made it off the ship but died in the water, what happened to these people?
The bodies in the water scattered all the way down this beach. Some of them washed up on shore, half dead, half alive, and they worked on them with these machines called pulmotors, which were some early respiratory machines that pumped oxygen into their lungs, and some people could be saved that way. Because of the current, bodies washed south of here, and there was a 10-mile stretch that they were washing up, and one policeman said that you could not go a mile in this stretch without finding one or two bodies of the victims. And because of the grim nature of this tragedy, sometimes burned body parts of the victims.
With dozens of bodies to contend with, the overwhelmed constabulary rushed to catalogue and house the dead.
The bodies that they recovered, they took to several temporary morgues, the largest of which was the Seagirt National Guard Training Center. The families would come and walk into these large rooms lined with identical cots, bodies under identical white sheets, and you would walk along and the body would be revealed to you. And it was absolutely horrifying to think of finding your dead loved one, but at a certain point it became even worse to think that you wouldn't find your dead loved one because that would mean they were missing. In these temporary morgues, they would also embalm the bodies, which was extremely important to preserve the dead bodies after the level of fire and the time in the water that they experienced in order to transport them either within the country or out of the country for burial.
There were over 110 victims of the fire recovered. Among them was the honeymooner Charles Filzer. His wife Selma had been pulled alive from the water, but the handsome businessman had been washed away. They'd only been married 8 days. Dr. Joseph Bregstein had taken his young son Mervyn on the voyage to soften the blow that he intended to marry again following the death of his wife, Mervyn's mother. Then had come the fire. Father and son had rushed up on deck and leapt over the side with sisters Gladys and Ethel Knight. The heavy seas had driven the little group apart. Joseph was picked up by a boat from Monarch of Bermuda, but he had no news of the sisters or his son. Eventually, he found Ethel and Gladys, but learned they'd lost Mervyn in the swell. The lad had been taken by the ocean, and he was never found. Franz de Besch was a 6'4" Cuban swimmer, just 18 years old. He'd given his life jacket away and leapt over the side of the burning ship. If anybody stood a chance at surviving the night, then it was him. But he was exhausted, last seen speaking with a woman in the water. He was pulled out to sea and never seen again. Nearly 10 other victims of the disaster were never found. In the end, the inquiry found that the disaster had been the result of negligence, that all but one deck officer and 2 of her senior engineers had handled the ship poorly and failed to coordinate an effective evacuation. The ship's construction, design, and fire prevention technology was found to be modern and completely satisfactory, but that the alarm itself was ineffective and the escapes had not been properly marked out. The report stated officers had waited too long to send the SOS, that the fire, which had broken out inside of a closed cupboard, was of an unknown origin, an act of God, but that it should have been contained and dealt with far easier than it had been. Acting Captain Worms was indicted for negligence. So was Chief Engineer Eben Abbott and Wardline's Vice President Henry Cabot. They were all sent to prison, but in the end an appeal released them because there was a far more obvious scapegoat. Captain Wilmot was a people pleaser who'd had fire hydrants capped so passengers wouldn't slip on them, but he'd failed to act decisively following the earlier fire in the cargo hold, and had done a poor job of managing his almost delinquent crew. The story passed from the headlines, and the world moved on. Rogers did his stage and radio shows, and was still hailed the hero of the tragedy. It had taken a full week for the fire to die out aboard the ship, and Asbury Park had enjoyed the lucrative tourist trade. But then, many of the tourists had gone home, and all that remained was the nauseating stench of burning hides and the ghastly charred wreck. In March 1935, the towering hulk of the ship was at last dislodged from the Asbury Park beach and towed to Baltimore, where she was broken up for scrap. The case, it seemed, was closed. But then, in 1953, nearly 20 years after the Morro Castle burned, George Rogers, the hero of the story, was arrested for double homicide. William Hummel was a 71-year-old friend of Rogers who lived at home with his daughter Edith. One day, after Rogers had driven him out to the bank, William and Edith had disappeared. A search of the home days later found them both dead and decomposing with horrible wounds to the head, clearly blunt force trauma. Rogers was arrested and charged with the murder, and suddenly a torrent of information came out about the man who had once worked to save the passengers and crew of Morro Castle. In 1949, William Hummel had written a note that said, "It may have been unwise on my part to continually advance him money, but said Rogers is very temperamental, and I was in constant fear." Rogers was deeply in debt to Hummel. He'd killed him to wipe out the loans. But this was far from Rogers' first brush with the law. His criminal record, dating back to well before he joined Morro Castle, makes for sobering reading. George Rogers was born in 1901 in New York, and from a young age, when he had lost both his parents, he displayed troubling behaviour. It had started with petty theft, and he was soon expelled a handful of times from various schools. He had a penchant for starting fires, and then, at age 15, he committed a violent sexual assault. A stint in the Navy saw him learn his trade as a radioman before he was discharged and went to work with the wireless EGERT company. Soon, he quickly left the company's employ, though, because they suspected him of starting a fire. That was in 1929, just 5 years before the Morro Castle. He had married Edith Edmondson in 1923, and then once poisoned and killed her pet dog because she had attended the funeral of a cousin he had wanted her to avoid. He had faked break-ins on past employers to steal their electrical equipment. This was the man who was hired by the Radiomarine Corporation of America and placed aboard the SS Morro Castle. At the inquiry, Rogers had painted out his subordinate, George Alania, to be a troublemaking communist and a source of antagonism on the ship. But maybe, just maybe, it had been Rogers all along, colluding with different crewmen, whispering into the captain's ear and stirring the pot to create a perpetual sense of suspicion and dread aboard. For Alania, it had been a professional death knell. The 28-year-old was unable to find any employment afterward because his name was linked inextricably with the so-called death ship. Rogers had started his own radio shop in his local Bayonne, New Jersey, but that too caught fire and burnt down, never mind the fact it had been struggling to turn a profit. He was still a kind of local hero though, and was picked up by the Bayonne Police Department to work in their radio room. He soon befriended Police Lieutenant Vincent Doyle, a proponent of radio systems in police communication. Once, the two had been casually chatting when the Morro Castle came up. Rogers outlined an unusually specific, detailed account of how he might go about setting a fire like that. That he'd fill up a fountain pen with two dangerous acids that, when mixed, react violently and heat exponentially. That a small copper separating piece could be slowly dissolved and act like a kind of timer until it failed and the mixture ignited. Doyle was taken aback and began to suspect that the suggestion wasn't hypothetical at all, that he might have just heard a confession. Shortly afterward, in 1938, Doyle received a package in the post, a fish tank heater that needed repair. He was an electronics enthusiast and sometimes tinkered with broken machinery, so he opened the box, plugged the heater into the wall, and then... A violent explosion blew out windows in the workshop and nearly shook the building apart. But Doyle survived, though his hand and his leg had been badly injured. He'd need to walk with a cane the rest of his life, but the most shocking result of the explosion was the investigation. It found that the heater had been packed with TNT and that Rogers had set it. He was sentenced to up to 20 years for attempted murder, and at last this repeat offender was safely behind bars. But then, fate intervened, and this is where the story becomes murky. George Rogers only served a few years before his release under a program that sought to set free first-time offenders if they were willing to volunteer for service on the home front against Nazi Germany and Japan. Remarkably, his parole request was approved, and he went to work at an aircraft factory and eventually became a foreman. When the war was over, Rogers did electrical odd jobs around Bayonne and became something of a town oddity, a kind of bombastic eccentric who would waste no time in holding a listener captive and explaining his many fantastical tales. Then, in 1953, came his final arrest, the double murder of William and Edith Hummel. One of the investigators was a man who walked with a limp and leant on a cane, Lieutenant Vincent Doyle. He wrote to Edith, Rogers' wife of 30 years, saying, "You have my deepest sympathy. I have known for many years that your husband broke the hearts of both your mother and father. He alienated your brother, Bill. He killed your dog because he went to the funeral of a cousin when he told you not to. He killed the captain of the Morro Castle before he set fire to the ship, killing 134 more people. But for the intervention of divine providence, he would have killed me. He killed your friends, the Hummels, and spent the money which he robbed from Bill Hummel's dead body. You're right when you say he deserves no sympathy." Rogers was at last sentenced to life imprisonment. He spent his days fixing radio equipment at New Jersey State Prison. He died just 5 years later, in 1958, taking whatever secrets remained with him. For 90 long years, authors and researchers have argued long and hard about Rogers' involvement in the disaster. His presence is undeniably a disturbing one, a man dubbed a career criminal since his teens and an expert in electricity and fire. But probably most disturbing of all is the status of his files as they rest with the US government. In 1985, an effort was made by researchers Robert McDonnell and Frederick Rasmussen to unseal his papers under the Freedom of Information Act, but a court ruling in 1993 set a bizarre series of precedents. The Rogers juvenile records from 1911 to 1922 remained sealed, and that the national security exemptions meant other records remained entirely closed off. FBI files on Rogers are heavily redacted, and some are nearly illegible. The researchers found that the FBI had investigated Rogers more heavily than any other person aboard the ship that night, dedicating hundreds of man-hours, and that his past, with all of its disturbing records, had to have been known about, but that it was never acted on, and most of the FBI's findings from way back in the 1930s have remained redacted and sealed to this day. It points to an unusual possibility, that Rogers might have served as an FBI informant on communist activity, or even an intelligence operative during the Second World War. The researchers' conclusions were that the US government, as far as George Rogers is concerned, is withholding something of a national embarrassment. The actual cause or reason for the fire has never been definitively explained. One theory went that the ward line, mired in the aftermath of the Depression and aware of the brewing troubles in Cuba, had engaged Rogers to burn the ship down on purpose to collect on the insurance. This seems unlikely. Another theory has pointed out the fire's origins as being close to the ship's funnel uptakes, that the heated uptakes, hundreds of degrees in temperature, might have been overheated by the intense winds of the storm, that a single failing section of insulation could see that the heat would be conducted directly to the panelling from behind. Assistant purser Tom Torreson had survived the night narrowly, but spent the rest of his life collecting news clippings and information on the fire. For his part, he bitterly disagreed that the ward line had burnt their own ship down for insurance. The inquiry had found that Acting Captain Worms and Officer Clarence Hackney had failed to shut the fire doors, but Torreson was glad they didn't, saying if they had, hundreds of passengers and crew would have been trapped. Torreson spent his years correcting mistakes in articles and newspapers, providing the facts as he had studied them and knew them from his own experience. He battled misinformation as best he could. When one paper suggested Captain Wilmot had capped every fire hydrant, Torreson pointed out that only one, on the B-deck portside promenade, had been capped, purely because it leaked.
Acting Captain Worms, in command when the ship caught fire, is escorted to the Board of Inquiry.
What do you think was the cause of the fire? Was it cigarettes? Perhaps. Probably not. Was it lightning? No. Incendiarism? Probably. As far as you know, were all the passengers notified of the fire? Yes. Captain, how do you account for reports that of the lifeboat used, most of them contained members of the crew? The crew is assigned to the lifeboats to operate them. Were the lifeboats in workable condition? Absolutely.
9 decades since Morro Castle caught fire and washed ashore, the facts of the case have been diluted into that dreaded word, conspiracy. Rogers is indicted and held to account in the public eye, and it seems like his many crimes have finally caught up with him. That dreadful night in 1934 is still etched in the mind of New Jersey residents, even though now it's just outside of living memory. We'll probably never know what really happened the night Morro Castle burned. Even the integrity of the inquiry is called into doubt. Dickerson N. Hoover, the chief of the committee, was the brother of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The inquiry found the Morro Castle's construction to be absolutely blameless, yet it failed to even call into question the heavily varnished wood panels that fed the voracious flames. At the backside of the panels featured deep channels that interconnected across virtually all of the bulkheads and meant flame could speed, unseen, from room to room without anybody even realizing. At least one person did pay attention: William Francis Gibbs, the aspiring naval architect. The image of the Morro Castle, tattered and blackened on the New Jersey beach, disturbed him so greatly that he vowed to design every ship he could to be as fireproof as practically possible. His magnum opus, the SS United States, was designed to feature no wood at all and boasted dozens and dozens of dedicated fire stations. Gibbs was dismayed to learn that the ship's piano had to be made of wood. He insisted it be made of fire-resistant mahogany, and he test-housed a section of material with gasoline and set it alight to make sure it wouldn't fully burn. But even so, the piano was surrounded by bare steel, fire-resistant furniture, and sheets of concealed asbestos. The Morro Castle's legacy on ship design was palpable. Asbestos companies even used it in their advertising. But the lessons still weren't fully digested. 30 years after Morro Castle burned, the cruise ship Laconia was lost in shockingly similar circumstances. Then, so too, the Yarmouth Castle. Rules and regulations became relaxed and crews became complacent. One crewman on Laconia in 1963 remembered he was trying to combat the blaze with a fire extinguisher that was dated from when the ship had been first fitted out all the way back in 1929. Today, strict rules dictate that wood panelling, the kind found on ships like Morro Castle, cannot be used at all, and that rooms are fitted with sprinklers throughout. But just as Morro Castle's legacy can still be felt in ship design today, so too it can be felt in Cuba, the nation it had so often visited. A shocked Cuban public mourned the ship, which had been a familiar sight in Havana, all the more because she'd been carrying Cuban passengers aboard. Franz de Besch, the young swimmer, became a local hero. A stadium was built in his honour, The popular vocal group, Trio Matamoros, composed the song El Desastre de Morro Castle in 1934, and it became a popular folk song in the Latin world. Today, if you want to see what remains of the Morro Castle, you need to visit the New Jersey Maritime Museum at Beach Haven, which holds a spectacular collection of carefully curated photos, films, and even artifacts, which hauntingly include passenger life jackets, life preservers, and even Alma Hill's silver Elgin watch. Stacked neatly in shelves against the walls are dozens of red binder folders containing thousands of pages of documents, including copies of the heavily redacted FBI files. The museum has been the pet project of historian and author Deborah Whitcraft, who's collected anything from the ship that she can get her hands on, and the collection today exists as the most complete assembly of Morro Castle paraphernalia probably in the world. Together with fellow researcher Gretchen Coyle, Deborah wrote Inferno at Sea, Stories of Death and Survival Aboard Morro Castle, which this video has been partly based on. It focuses on the human stories from the night and includes dozens of accounts which never made it into the public record until the book was published. Just outside the museum, waves gently lap on a sandy seashore, one of the most enchanting coastlines in the world, where Victorian homesteads and hotels rest easily by the Atlantic. It's hard to imagine the same spot 90 years ago, when a burning ocean liner lit up the night sky like a flare. The Morro Castle had been the darling of US shipbuilding, but her loss changed hundreds, even thousands of lives, and continues to intrigue us to this day. In a letter to Alma Hill, Raymond Egan, the Reverend, who'd been hailed as a hero, summed survivor attitudes up best when he said, "I know that you must feel the same about mentioning the accident as I do. The sooner we can forget, the better." The ship's passengers and crew wanted to move on with their lives, and not live them out as just survivors or heroes. Today, Morro Castle really is all but forgotten about, an oddity in New Jersey's history, a curiosity for an online article or occasional social media post. But for decades, those left behind by the disaster had to live with its looming shadow. Young Bobby Gonzalez had died in the tragedy. Years and years later, his younger sister, Pepita, by then 83, remembered the young boy who loved to dance as vividly as if he were still alive. "I adored him," she said. "I loved him, and we always prayed for him. My mother never got over Bobby. She wore black the rest of her life. She never smiled again."
you.